Welcome to this month's IQ Academy webinar. This month we're taking a look at some current issues in mineral planning with David Payne, Senior Planning Advisor at the MPA. And I'll now pass you over to David.
I'm just going to run through for about half an hour some slides updating you on current issues that we're dealing with as regards minerals planning. So as an overview, it's going to be a state of play of what's happening in GB, particularly England and Wales, over the last year in terms of reserves, resources, supply and demand. Then some work MPA is doing to look at future demand and future supply scenarios to inform government planning, ideally. And then finally, just flagging up a couple of things which we're working on to improve the way policy is working and the support that government is giving to it. First of all, just some context around the size of the sector, which you'll probably be familiar with. The data comes from various MPA documents and CBI Minerals Group documents. So overall, 390 million tonnes production of aggregates and mineral products. The biggest material flow within that is construction aggregates, which I've highlighted here, and I'll be focusing a lot on aggregates because of the scale of the flow, which means that's where we have most of the planning and regulatory issues. And within that, the mix of aggregates is nearly 50% crushed rock, about a third recycled as secondary, and then land one aggregates, land one sand and gravel, and marine sand and gravel, which is taking an increasing proportion. Overall, it's around 1 million tonnes of material and products every day of the year that's being produced and moved around the country. Again, some context in terms of sales and the size of the market since the mid-50s. The important thing to look at, I think, is the recession 2008-2009, where construction activity fell off a cliff, and with it, sales and use of construction aggregates. And you'll notice over the last 3 or 4 years, the market has started to pick up again. The mix has remained, over the last 10 years, it's remained reasonably constant. It's worth pointing out that of the sand and gravel component, around a fifth is for marine dredged sand and gravel. So the first part of the presentation is an overview of what's happening at the moment. The MPA undertakes the annual mineral planning survey every year. This is a survey of MPA members. We ask them about sales, reserves, newly permitted reserves, how long it's taking them to get reserves permitted through the planning system. So it's an annual snapshot of trends in material supply and demand, but also a barometer of how the planning system is working from our members' perspective. But it's based in hard facts rather than opinion. So the headlines, 2018, so the 2019 survey is going to deal with 2018 data. Sales are up again on 2017, but the amount of reserves that are being permitted each year is below the sales level. So effectively, we've got gradual depletion as replenishment is below 100% for both sand and gravel and for rock. Discuss that a bit later on. Planning application, the number of applications is low, so only 19 in the year for new reserves. That includes extensions, but new permitted reserves to extract. But of that, the approval rate is very high, so it's over 90% at GB level and in most regions. So it suggests that it isn't the planning system per se that's the problem, it's lack of confidence in the market to put the applications in. And it takes a long time to get planning permission, and it's a very expensive process, but it can take over 30 months for when you actually submit an application to when it's permitted and you get the planning permission to extract. So it's not a quick process, it's an expensive process, and it's slow. So I'm going to show you a few graphs now just to capture what I've just said. This is for sand and gravel. So the top graph shows the number of applications over the last 20 years nearly, and you can see quite a stable pattern for the last 10 years, but quite a low number of applications for sand and gravel. mostly extensions, but below 20 applications per year. And the bottom graph shows the rate of approval or refusal. So very few are actually refused. There were a few in 2017, you'll see, and a couple withdrawn before they got to determination, which is an issue in itself in terms of likelihood of getting the permission. But overall, over 90% are permitted. In terms of the tonnage in applications, again, it goes up and down, not surprisingly. 2018 was a good year in terms of new reserves being permitted in terms of tonnage. Of course, those aren't necessarily the applications that were submitted in 2018. They may have been submitted 2015, 16, and taken that long before they got approval. But a positive trend for the last 3 years anyway. And the bottom graph turns that into comparing new reserves against sales. So are newly permitted reserves keeping up with the rate of extraction and sales from sites? And clearly it's not. The average over the last 10 years is around 63%. So 2018 was a good year because of the number of permissions, but the long-term average is still below parity. So if that continues, clearly, particularly for sand and gravel, where each site's reserves are relatively small, the sites are relatively short-lived. If you're starting to deplete and eat into the reserve, there's going to be a problem down the line. Moving on to rock, again, a varied picture of the number of applications. Very few in 2018, one new site only, but the other two for extensions. And again, the vast majority are permitted or withdrawn. There's very few refusals, which is interesting in itself. So the applications that are being taken forward are being approved. They are consistent with the development plan. They're demonstrating need. They're demonstrating environmental impacts can be managed acceptably. And again, a similar graph to the sand and gravel one for the tonnage. So large tonnages in big hits, particularly you can see 2007, which I think was Glen Sander, and then 2011 Barden Hill, 2012 Tor down in Somerset. If you're looking at the 10-year average, see Glen Sander drops off there. So the 10-year average for replenishment goes down because you don't have the big hit from Glen Sander. So replenishment rate is around 75%. So it's not such an issue with rock because you've got very, very large reserves and very large land banks and very large sites. But still, a downward trend on replenishment is a warning sign in terms of applications not being submitted. But those that are submitted, like sand and gravel, the majority are approved. Just giving you a regional picture on the replenishment rate. Obviously, the line through the middle is the 100%, so permitted reserves equaling sales. So you'd have 100% replenishment. There'd be no depletion of reserves. All regions, in terms of sand and gravel, apart from Yorkshire and Humber, just are below. So in all of these regions, there is a gradual depletion of reserves over the 10-year period. On rock, the dots are quite close to parity, apart from East Midlands, which is a concern given that East Midlands is a major supplier of rock into other markets, particularly London and the South East. But South West, being the other major supplier, is reasonably healthy. So that's quite an interesting picture. Gives you a flavour of which areas are becoming depleted or will gradually become depleted in reserves over time. So reflecting that on a GB level, an England and Wales level, is the amount of permitted reserves. So reflecting the trend of gradual depletion from 2001 down to 2014. And these data are from the Aggregate Minerals surveys, which DCLG undertakes, which is going to be repeated this year for 29 data. So we'll have an update next year with 2019. But you can see the trend generally is downwards, including for crushed rock, particularly. This is where the big hit is. But England, sand and gravel as well, the blue line at the bottom, you can see a story of depletion. I mentioned it taking 30 months for applications to be permitted. That's shown graphically. Again, it varies. The long-term average is around 27, 30 months, some longer, some shorter. And individual applications, as you'll probably be aware, some can take 10 years to get permitted. So yeah, it's a very mixed picture. Where the reserves are, not surprising, they reflect obviously the geology. So large reserves in the East Midlands and Southwest of rock in particular. And as I say, Southwest is reasonably healthy. There's a little bit of concern with reserves going down and not being replenished in the East Midlands with closure of site. And you'll be familiar with these drawings from the AM reports, just showing the distribution and movement of material from the producing areas to the market areas and the major movements of crushed rock, particularly from the Midlands and the Southwest into London and the Southeast, with sand and gravel movements much more local. Okay, so just to recap on the state of play, sales appear to be recovering over the last few years and increasing in recent years. Rock sales are twice those of sand and gravel, but the overall picture in terms of new permissions not keeping up with sales in the long term means there is a gradual depletion of reserves, which we just need to keep an eye on, particularly for sand and gravel. For rock, it's less of an issue because of the large size of the reserves, but that doesn't necessarily mean they can supply the market and supply demand, because there's going to be capacity issues in terms of getting the material out of the gate and getting it onto rail paths to feed into the various markets. Small number of applications, but most permitted, and taking a long time to get permissions. So that's really an overview of the MPA's AMPS report this year. So obviously concern about depletion. We've got concerns with the MPA around localism and the managed aggregate supply system not working, with each mineral planning authority devising its own scenarios and forecasts of demand, which tend to be based on historic sales rather than a genuine forecast of demand. So I'm just going to describe some work that the MPA has been doing through our economists, but also with our planning team, looking at what the future might hold in realistic terms, in the absence of any government overview, and in the absence of any strategic planning, apart from coordination through the aggregates working parties. But we do lack a strategic overview from government, from MHCLG at the moment. So the MPA has taken it on itself to think from an industry perspective what the future might hold in terms of demand, but also how we may meet that demand. So this schematic describes a general approach we're taking to deriving a view on future aggregate demand and supply. So it starts with the available data up to 2018, with projections covering 2019 up to 2030. So we're looking at economic growth and construction activity, which are significant factors for demand of minerals, and assumptions about future activity, which we use to estimate the demand for those materials. In terms of construction forecast, we use Construction Industry Training Board and Oxford Economic Forecasts, which suggests 1.3 per annum growth 2019 to 2023, followed by 1% to 2030. Now, aggregates demand, not just based on construction activity, but on material intensity. So we also factor that in. So we made assumptions around intensity, which is, we term intensity the volume of material used per 1,000 pounds of spent in construction activity. Variations in intensity can have a significant effect on the future level of material demand. For example, as technology progresses, different types of construction methods, there's promotion of off-site, modern methods of construction, could have an effect on the wet working. Different types of material being used, more steel, more glass, even a promotion of timber. So that will all have an effect on the amount of aggregate that's used in construction per 1,000 pounds spent. And the trend has been for use of aggregates falling by a third per 1,000 pound construction spend between 1999 and 2018. so from 2.3 down to 1.5 tonnes per pound. So an average decline of around 2%, but it would be unrealistic to consider that forever, but it may well continue for some time in the future. So we developed two scenarios, which are down the bottom there. We look at a baseline scenario, so material intensity remains as it is at the moment, so it's an assumption that it's reached its optimum intensity or efficiency. And an alternative scenario looking at further reductions in intensity with downward pressures on total aggregate demand over the next 10 years. Now, these aren't forecasts, our economist stresses. They are scenarios, illustrative projections to provide a contrast between the base assumption of steady intensity. And in practice, of course, the truth is probably going to be somewhere in between. So the main components of aggregate supply you'll probably be familiar with, and I've highlighted them here. So crushed rock is a major component of primary aggregate, nearly twice the size of sand and gravel, which includes marine, and then recycled, so construction, demolition, excavation waste, particularly the construction and demolition, the hard fraction, represents about 30% of overall mineral supply, overall aggregate supply, sorry. So in 2017, a total of 176 million tonnes of primary aggregates were produced by the industry. So together with 72 million tonnes recycled and secondary. So then we look at the drivers affecting supplies. And it's not meant to be exhaustive, it's just an example of the method that we've used. So resource availability, they're widely available. Aggregates, key factor influencing the supply is the way this planning system works and the regularity system works to enable reserves to be permitted and extracted. And in 2014, permitted reserves of land-1 aggregates were around 4 billion tonnes. And the Crown Estate indicates that viable reserves of primary and marine aggregates is around 370 million tonnes. But things aren't that simple. We've already mentioned replenishment rate. So indicating that for sand and gravel, land-1 sand and gravel, there's a potential constraint on availability that we need to think about if reserves aren't being replenished by, sold reserves aren't being replenished by new reserves being permitted. So that we factored this into our scenarios of what the supply might look like. So also factoring into supply, we look at the recycles and secondaries, around a third of the GB market, which is actually, we think, one of the highest rates in Europe. So we think and we assume that we're at about the optimum level of supply. We don't think the supply can go much above 30% because the vast majority of the hard fraction of construction demolition waste is already being either reused on site or recycled back into recycled aggregates. And of course, it can't substitute for all uses either. So you can't use it in structural concrete, for example. So it can't substitute for all land-1 material. So we've adopted a pretty constant proportion of contribution by recycled and secondaries. Imports, we've not really factored in because actually in terms of overall supply, they're going to be very low, less than 5 million tonnes. It's a bulky material, low value. It's unlikely to be financially beneficial to import aggregates. So we've not really factored this in as a major consideration. Another factor is getting the material around. So obviously moving hard rock, if you're substituting land-1 sand and gravel in some parts of the country, for example, the southeast, by increasing import of crushed rock from the Midlands and the Southwest, you need to consider whether there are constraints on the transport infrastructure. An example here of brand new flats with balconies being constructed in Woking next to a rail depot, overlooking the rail depot, which potentially going to put constraints on it. So safeguarding in planning is going to be very important in terms of maintaining the ability to move the material around. So considering all that, we've considered 4 main scenarios. I'm going to focus on a couple here. First one being no change in the current supply mix. So we'll look at the current mix in 2018, carry that forward. And another one I'm looking at here is, again, it's only a scenario, but it's reflecting some of the evidence I've already mentioned around depleting resources of Land 1 sand and gravel, reserves, sorry, of Land 1 sand and gravel, particularly in places like the southeast and London, with a combination of marine dredged sand and gravel, which a lot of that gets imported into London and the southeast, and greater use of crushed rock to substitute for Land 1 sand and gravel, really reflecting the trends we've just seen, but also what we know on the ground of depletion of reserves and resources. So the resource not actually being there in sufficient quality or amount in some areas of the southeast, for example, plus designations, the effect of national parks and AONBs, and the planning system in resisting new sites in terms of planned allocations or even planning permissions in those areas. We think that sort of scenario could well be maybe at the extreme, but it's one worth looking at. So just to illustrate scenario one, no change in the supply mix. You can see the graphs on the right, which show the two curves, if you like, the top one being baseline, so no increase in intensity. The bottom one being an increasing intensity of use, so fewer aggregates used per thousand pounds of construction. And you come up with these kind of figures and this kind of mix. So at the moment on this one, split between primary aggregates reflects the shares for marine sand and gravel, around 22%, and total sand and gravel, around 35%. And looking at the other scenario, this one looks at declining sand and gravel and a combination of marine and crushed rock substituting for that, which will rely on, as I mentioned, the infrastructure being available and the rail depots and wharves having sufficient capacity to import this material. But overall, the Land 1 sand and gravel volume is assumed to decline, around 5% per annum fall to 26 million tonnes in 2030, and then that compensated by an increase in marine dredged and crushed rock. So all we're doing here is trying to, we've tested this with our members to say, you know, do these look like reasonable, viable scenarios for the future? Because if they do, this is the story we need to be telling to government in terms of producing a national statement of need, in terms of updating the regional guidelines for aggregates, to provide some sort of baseline of what planning authorities, individual planning authorities, need to be planning for, rather than just planning on their own grounds, looking at past sales as a forecast for the future. But of course, it's not as simple as that. Substituting with crushed rock uses crushed rock isn't necessarily a substitute for certain materials. So you have to look at what is being replaced, and there's still going to be a need for the fine materials for sand, the suitability for the end use, material availability, the environmental implications of substitution need to be factored in. But overall, the main message from the work we've done here indicates that by 2030, we're still going to need, even with efficiency, between 237 and 285 million tonnes of aggregates each year to respond to construction needs. So cumulatively, that's between 3 and 3.2 billion tonnes of material that we're going to need by 2030, even with an increasing intensity. So it's a very important message for government and for mineral planning authorities. The demand isn't going away. You can't be efficient and get your way out of this. You're going to need a lot of material. All of that needs permitting and planning. So there are sufficient indigenous materials available, but issues around the supply mix, the location, how you get materials around, and the timing, particularly timing of new reserves coming online, given it takes so long through the planning system. So moving finally on to planning and what we're trying to influence. There is national planning policy in each of the home nations. National planning policy framework in England was updated in 2018, and again this year, a few minor pieces. It still has a minerals chapter, which is a win for industry because it wasn't going to have a minerals chapter. And actually we got most of the words which were in the original MPPF retained in the new one after a discussion with MHCLG to explain why minerals are important and why they're important to deliver all the other stuff in the MPPF. And it still says this, which is very helpful. So the essentiality of minerals. And interestingly, in the government's response to the consultation on the MPPF, so the MPPF includes the right policies, we think, mostly, but what was revealing was what the government said in response to the consultation. So there's now a clear understanding of the need for the planning system to deliver security of supply, and a sufficient supply of materials is essential. Now that sounds obvious, but these words were taken out of the MPPF, the draft MPPF, and our fear was that's going to weaken even more the link in planners and politicians' minds between the need for minerals and delivery of housing and infrastructure, etc. So the chapter was retained. That's a win. It's important. It also says you need to consider minerals alongside other land use planning policies. Again, pretty obvious, but as we know, dealing with the planning system, minerals planning is seen as an entity in its own right and operates in a silo. Local planning authorities and local planners and local politicians in district councils who are permitting housing and economic development don't really think about minerals, which has an adverse consequence of sterilisation of mineral resources in a lot of cases, or effects on minerals infrastructure with sensitive uses being allocated and permitted and built next to things like wharves, rail depots. So safeguarding came through in the government response, which was very welcome, and the need to coordinate mineral supply alongside these other components of development and disciplines of planning. And again, finally, very useful words in terms of government recognising there's a risk of under-provision unless it does some work to forecast future needs. And again, the senior civil servant we spoke to at CLG initially didn't understand what the managed aggregate supply system was or why we had top-down planning for minerals when we didn't have it for other things, in his view, even though you do for housing. So it was very important that they actually understood the case has been made for revitalising the managed aggregate supply system. Not a lot has been done on that yet, but the work we've done on the scenarios, the future scenarios, we're intending to work with government on that to inform a review of the national and subnational guidelines for aggregate production. Now they run until 2020, which is obviously next year, so they're not being given any weight by planning inspectors or planning authorities, but they're the only document which sets out a national statement of need at the moment and quantifies it. Without that, there's no benchmark for each of the mineral planning authorities and each of the aggregate working parties to assess whether an adequate contribution is being made to national supply. Now, the good news is there's a guy at MHCLG now who's next head of minerals planning, who understands minerals, understands the sector, and is doing his best to fight our corner within the ministry. And he is pressing for resources to review the guidelines. He sees that as a priority. He understands why that's important. So some good news on that front. Related to that, last year, the CBI Minerals Group with the MPA produced the UK Minerals Strategy. Now, this has been a decade in gestation. It's produced by not just the MPA, the British Aggregate Association, a lot of other trade associations who are on the CBI Minerals Group together with the companies. And the point of doing this was really to press the case for a national statement of need. And I refer to the 3 billion tonnes of aggregates that are going to be required. If you round that up over the next 25 years for all minerals, it's going to be around 5 billion tonnes. So the strategy is a clear statement: we're going to need this much material. A lot of it's going to be primary, and it's going to be indigenous resources. So it needs to be planned for and permitted. The government's got a role to play in delivering this, but industry has too, in terms of submitting sufficient good planning applications in right place and promoting sufficient new reserves through sites in plans. And the important thing was making the link between mineral supply and economic development and infrastructure development. So just quickly, this is the strategy. It's very high level. The decision was made to keep it high level because actually the messages, even though they're simple, weren't getting through. So we've got to make them really simple. And a lot of these are around demand and importance. Again, going back to the work we're doing on scenarios, it's government that should be doing this, actually. They should provide a clear national policy and statement of need for minerals. For aggregates, they should be doing that through the guidelines. But for other minerals, there is also a clear need for a statement of need to set their national context for local decisions. Planning and regulation needs to be properly resourced. So we all know planning authorities, some authorities have got nobody left, literally. Some are better resourced, but the system is creaking. Not enough planners are coming through and being retained by the mineral planning authorities. So the quality of planning is low. The confidence within planning departments is low. Decisions take longer than they should and are more resource and information hungry, together with much more sophisticated opposition and coordinated opposition to development. So proper resourcing of planning and regulation. And you remember the graphs I showed showing that industry isn't really submitting enough planning applications. So it's industry to get its act together and think about the future properly and make sure we're promoting adequate and appropriate sites. Okay, so just a quick summing up. Sales look like they're recovering, which is good news, reflecting the overall construction market, but it's precarious, as everybody understands, given uncertainties. Small number of applications, but the planning system seems to be dealing with those reasonably well in terms of permitting them, but taking time to do so. But there's a lack of national overview and lack of national management, particularly the managed aggregate supply system. There's some improvement at CLG recently. We have, say, a member of staff who has the ear of his director and is promoting funding for the guidelines, but also funding for aggregates working parties, and managed to secure the funding for next year's aggregates minerals survey. So some good news at government level, but it's still hard work and quite a small resource. I've described the scenarios we're doing to try and inform the government and help it along its way. And the link between development and material supply is fundamental. And finally, supply cannot be assumed, and we need national statement of need to support delivery. Of course, we've not run out of material, so what we need is a crisis to really focus minds. At the moment, it's quite difficult to make these arguments about we're planning to avoid the crisis in the future. There isn't a crisis at the moment. And I think the relationships we've now got at CLG are helping this along the way. They understand what planning is about. It's about planning for the future, not planning to resolve a crisis. Thank you very much.